Let's look at now the pluses and minuses of different forms of funding and why you might prefer one to the other as a startup. In order to compare different forms of funding, I like to look at the funding options along 4 dimensions. What is the cost of that funding method? What degree of control is given up by existing shareholders when funding method is used? What is the impact of that funding method on the company's growth potential? And what is the incremental risk of that form of investment to existing shareholders? So if we start with internal funding or organic funding, obviously has the lowest cost because the cost of the internal funding is just the entrepreneur's opportunity cost of capital, which is typically going to be much less than their cost of debt capital or equity capital. In degree of control given up, nothing, because the entrepreneur funding with their own capital, so they don't give up any control. So far, internal funding looks good. Low cost and no control given up. And these are definitely the major advantages. But when we get to the impact on growth, internally funded companies will always grow more slowly than the same company funded with debt or equity. Why? All companies have internal funding. When companies raise money through either debt or equity, that debt or equity funding goes on top of their internal funding, and therefore the company that's debt or equity funded will always have more money than it would have had if it was only internally funded. I mentioned in previous video that more money doesn't guarantee faster growth, for sure, but growth potential is higher with more money when that money is used effectively to fund growth. So the incremental growth from internal funding will always be the lowest by definition. When we look at the degree of financial risk to the existing shareholders with internal funding, it's, I would say, medium risk because the existing shareholders have not diversified any of the financial risk in this business to either shareholders or lenders. They are keeping 100% of that risk for themselves, which is, I would say, higher than for equity funded business. Second form of funding, debt. Debt is definitely more expensive than internal funding, but will be less expensive than equity funding. So put it in the middle in terms of cost. Degree of control given up, not much control of the business will be given up to a lender, especially a bank lender, although the loan agreements will limit the company's ability to act as freely as they would have been able to act if there was no loan. So there will be some change in the degree of control that the existing owners have in the business after they take debt. Growth will definitely be faster with debt than with internal funding, but will be slower than growth with equity funding. Why? Because for several reasons. One is that debt funding amounts will typically be lower than equity funding amounts, meaning lenders will typically be willing to give less money, especially to a startup in the form of a loan, than equity investors would be willing to give to that same startup. Even if the company could get the exact same amount of money in debt or equity funding, the debt funding would still have a lesser impact on growth because some of the company's money would need to be used to service the debt interest payments, which isn't the case with equity. So far, debt looks okay, intermediate between internal funding and equity, but there is a serious problem with debt. Debt in the incremental risk to existing shareholders, I put debt very high. And there are several reasons for that. The first and most important reason is a high growth startup is generally or almost always characterized by having highly uncertain and unpredictable cash flow, especially in the early stage of its growth. Debt is almost always characterized by an obligation by the borrower to pay back the principal and interest due on a regular schedule. So by superimposing a regular requirement for the company to repay the loan on highly uncertain and unpredictable cash flows, the company puts their shareholders at, I would say, unacceptable level of risk. I like to use an analogy: if you just lost your job and you have no visibility on what your future income is going to be, I doubt that you would think this was a good time to go out and buy a house with a mortgage that you were required to start paying back right away. Startups are typically in a very similar position. They don't know when the cash is coming in, they don't know how much is coming in, yet now they have a fixed loan obligation that they have to pay back typically every month. So this is problem one. Problem two is debt funding creates the possibility that the company might fail just because they can't pay back the debt. So everything else might be going well in the company, but the company is unable to meet their regular debt obligations and the company fails just because the company chose debt rather than equity funding. Again, that's a second risk, which I think is an unacceptable level of risk for a startup to take. Third problem with debt funding is because equity investors know about the first two problems, so debt funding often may make it more difficult for a startup to raise equity funding after they have debt. For example, some equity investors will require that the startup come to the equity investment debt-free, which means that the startup, if they have already taken debt, would be required to pay back the debt before they could get equity funding. So this can put the startup into a double bind. They took debt funding, they would now like to get equity funding, but they can't get equity funding because they took debt funding. So for those reasons, I would strongly advise, as an early stage startup, never fund with debt, which leaves us with our third option, which is equity funding. Equity funding will be the most expensive because equity investors in high growth startups are taking very high risk and therefore require very high return. The existing shareholders who are at early stage, typically the founders, will be giving up some significant degree of control because a lot of equity investors will require investment and shareholder agreements that constrain actions that the company might take that those investors believe are detrimental to their interest. This can significantly constrain actions that the management team or the board of the company might take prior to the investment. This highlights the fact that equity investors are not vendors, like the bank is a vendor supplying the company with capital. Equity investors are partners. The most important difference between debt and equity funding is that equity funding is permanent capital. Debt funding is temporary. Permanent capital comes from partners. The relationship with the bank lender ends when the company successfully repays their loan. So equity investors are in for the long term, and this can be both plus and minus for the founders and existing shareholders, but the degree of control given up is real. This is the factor that deters entrepreneurs from taking equity funding. My advice is, if you do a good and smart deal with equity investors, you can manage the degree of control given up while still getting all the benefits of equity funding, which are coming now. So the main benefits of equity funding is the impact on growth. Your business will grow as fast as possible with equity funding because, one, equity funding is permanent, so you don't need to pay it back. Two, startup companies are typically able to acquire much more equity funding than they are debt funding, and I already talked about how the amount of funding for growth will be much higher than internally generated. Last, the incremental financial risk to existing shareholders. Because equity capital is permanent, equity capital for me is the lowest risk form of capital that the company can take. If the company fails, in a typical equity investment case, the equity investors have no recourse, the money is lost. So the existing shareholders are able to diversify the risk in the business. Typically, they're able to raise a lot more capital from equity investors than they themselves put into the business, meaning the bulk of the capital in the business will have come from external investors. And if the business fails, the external investors will be bearing most of the pain of that financial loss. So those are the pluses and minuses of equity capital, debt capital, and internally generated funding. I think it's pretty clear from this discussion that equity capital is the preferred method of funding for high growth startups.